Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. It's Ukraine War News Update, third part thereof for the 23rd of November 2023. This video is solely on geopolitics. There's so much news coming out today, I've had to split it up. We're going to start with this Euromaidan press article concerning polling in America. 45% of Americans consider Ukraine aid too high. You might think that is itself a high figure, but actually it's a reduction, which is good news, from last month's figures, which found that 52% found that US aid to Ukraine was excessive. So that's moved down to 45%, and that's underwritten by, interestingly, a Republican shift here. So the GOP opposition decreases from 69% to 59%. So Republican voters still favouring cutting aid to Ukraine, but that move is represents less than it did last month. So that's really good. 38% of Americans view spending as right. Okay, so that's, I guess, a move in the right direction. Just in terms of disinformation, I know this doesn't pertain to Ukraine at all, but it's interesting. One of the best podcasts on Ukraine, in my opinion, is the Ukraine The Latest podcast, which is run by the Daily Telegraph. That's a stalwart of the UK print news media. Actually, the digital service is doing quite well for them. So football clubs are one thing, but it's fundamentally bad idea for any authoritarian country to own your newspapers or media outlets. Sheikh Mansour bin Zayed Al Nahyan, the Deputy Prime Minister of the United Arab Emirates, has reportedly been directly involved. So this is a bid to take over the Daily Telegraph. And that, when you have outside entities owning really prominent news mouthpieces, news sources for a country, then I think that is a real conflict of interest. And I think this is where government need to think seriously about regulating, as indeed the Culture Secretary, Lucy Fraser, has said she is minded to launch an investigation. Yeah, might do. Of Abu Dhabi's bid to take control of the Telegraph. Fraser is considering issuing a notice to start a regulatory investigation into whether it would go against the public interest. I think that is incredibly important. We've just seen Forbes, the takeover of Forbes magazine, be called off due to connections, one thinks, to a Russian oligarch. Okay, state budget of Ukraine received a $400 million guarantee from Great Britain through the trust fund of the World Bank. The funds will go to pensions and doctors' salaries. So, it's a $400 million, I guess, grant, or some kind of monies from the World Bank, but that is guaranteed. So it's actually probably a loan, I guess, guaranteed by Great Britain through the trust fund of the World Bank, which means I think if the Ukraine were to default, it's not that Great Britain had given them that money. It's if you default on your loans, we'll pick up the cost. So that is good to allow Ukraine to function as a state still. Hungarian, I had a bit of a yesterday. I just said on Twitter as a result of this coming out that, oh my god, I hate Viktor Orban. Anyway, turns out my sentiments haven't changed in 24 hours. So Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban wrote a letter to the President of the European Council, Charles Michel, we're going to hear from him in a second, where he threatens to block all EU decisions on Ukraine, according to Politico. In fact, we'll probably go there next. In a letter, the Hungarian leader states that no decisions on financing Ukraine, the opening of negotiations on accession to the EU, or further sanctions against the Russian Federation can be made until EU leaders reconsider the strategy for supporting Kyiv. I really dislike this chap an awful lot. And in fact, let's go and talk about Charles Michel that was mentioned here, the European Council president. He was interviewed by Kyiv Independent. Really interesting interview this. Not going to go there, actually. Going to go to some of these questions. I'll just dip into a few of it, but it's worth looking into the whole article and all his questions and answers. But we'll look at a couple of them. Kyiv Independent. How will you persuade Hungary to accept Ukraine? Will you unblock 13 billion euros to frozen funds? And Michel answers, some suspicions expressed by observers that the Hungarian position could be linked with some bilateral irritants between Hungary and the European Commission. But the most important thing for me is to make sure that the EU is acting in a geopolitical way. It means that we need to understand what's at stake and what's and what's at stake on the European continent. This is peace, security, prosperity. This EU project is based on those fundamental principles. Russia has decided to launch a war, a full-scale invasion, not only against Ukraine, but it's also a war against security in the world, including in Europe. And that's why it is fundamental that the 27 members make the right choices to ensure we prepare a better future for our children and grandchildren. He didn't quite answer the question there, and I'd like him to have done that. But I think he's recognising, I mean, he knows that Hungary is a right thorn in the side of the EU, and certainly a thorn in the side of continued assistance to Ukraine. Talks about the shells, million shells program, elections in Ukraine, so on and so forth. We're going to come back to it later, where the question is, Europe always says it will support Ukraine for as long as it takes, but every new military and financial aid sanction package takes longer and longer. Will Europe still be able to produce this amount of support for Ukraine in 2024 or 2025? And he says, I'm quite sure. If you observe that what we have been doing since the start of the full-scale invasion, we succeeded in deciding on 11 packages of sanctions, and the 12th package is currently being discussed. We reacted very quickly, and we always remember the hours following the full-scale invasion. When we were at the European Council meeting in Brussels, we decided on the strategy. Who are following this strategy of fully supporting Ukraine as much as we can. We know that sanctions take some time before they have a real and sustainable effect on a country. You can imagine that what the situation would be without this united support by the EU, the Americans and other partners. It's very clear that in terms of financial support, for instance, at the beginning, we made decisions case by case. Then we decided to work on a multi-annual approach to provide more predictability to the Ukrainian authorities who are working closely with the IMF. For instance, to make sure that we support in terms of macro financial assistance. In each meeting that I have with President Zelensky, each phone conversation, we have discussed in depth what are the additional modalities and what are the additional concrete elements we can decide on and put in place to strengthen our support for Ukraine and to maximize the impact of sanctions against Russia, including by addressing the circumvention of sanctions and making sure that we convince many countries not to allow Russia to escape those things. Kyiv Independent says, sorry, it is possible because Russia is able to obtain, for example, Czech parts or US parts for its missiles. And he replies, the lack of the last pack of sanctions is directly inspired by the cooperation with our intelligence services and the Ukrainian intelligence services based on what we can see on the battlefield. For instance, we are now targeting more and more what we call dual-use goods because it is so important to consider how Russia is trying to adapt its industrial base. That's why in terms of certain sanctions packages, we constantly need to adapt our framework to try to reduce the possibilities for Russia to escape these sanctions. And the Kyiv Independent then asks, you also mentioned the US is it fair to say that the US elections will directly impact the European Union and support for Ukraine? I want to be clear, he says, we are very important partners and allies with the US, but we have our own destiny and we need to demonstrate that we are able to make our own decisions. And I sincerely hope we can count on the full support of the US in the future. I'm very grateful to President Joe Biden and his administration for his very close cooperation and this common approach to Ukraine and the security of the European continent. One thing is absolutely certain for the EU, Ukraine and the candidate countries in the future. It's very important to make sure that we have more domestic tools with more capabilities to be more resilient and to have more influence in the future. So this is this idea that they do need to move, like Macron was talking about this with regard to France. We need to move away from the American sphere of influence, not because we're not mates or whatever, but we need to be independent in our own decision making. And that you would presume would be agreed upon by many in America who say, look, we don't want to be the world's policeman all the time, blah, blah, blah. And of course, there's a question of like, well, if you position yourself as that, then people will expect that role of you. So it's a kind of like chicken and the egg scenario. If you have global hegemony, you're top of that hegemonic ladder, then those are responsibilities you have if you want to maintain your power up there. So, you know, there's lots to be said about that, but this kind of move here by the EU and what Charles Michel is saying, I think will certainly please many on the right in the US, but I think it's in the EU's best interest to have that kind of independence. but still work really closely with the US. So then it talks about, potential for a Trump victory. I'm not going to go too much into that, other than say, he says there will be elections in the US, there will be elections within the EU. Okay, this is clear, but it is our duty to make sure that public opinion, our citizens in the US and Europe, understand the seriousness of the situation. Of course, he doesn't want to go around bashing Trump or getting into hot water with one side or another in the US, because that will come back and bite him on the backside. So he needs to be very diplomatic with his answers here. Some interesting stuff there. Nothing crazily unexpected, but worth having a little read, I think. Right, Bulgaria will stop importing crude oil from Russia in March 2024. According to the Ministry of Energy of Ukraine, the decision will prevent Russia from bypassing Western sanctions and block the opportunity to earn 1 billion euros. That's super important. Well done, Bulgaria. I hope that works. Russian media. Russians consider Cyprus and Hungary to be top locations for foreign investment. Who knew? We knew that was the case. We knew Cyprus is a place where a lot of Russian money is laundered. We knew London previously has been. I don't know what it's like now. But also Hungary is becoming increasingly just a lapdog of the Russian, of the Kremlin. Of the Russian state. Russians who plan to buy property abroad are most interested in investing in Cyprus and Hungary, according to Russian media outlet RBC, citing the state agency NF Group. The company said that 61% of its clients want to buy real estate abroad in order to obtain a residence permit or citizenship in that country. We know that Turkey, that's big for the Russians, as if you buy enough property there, then you get a Turkish passport. That's a really useful thing for well-off people in Russia to consider. Okay, now we're moving on to one of the big pieces of news that came out yesterday, which is the Dutch election. And you've got anti-Islam populist Geert Wilders winning a dramatic victory. He's been famous for some time. He's a very divisive figure, very much like many of the populists we've seen recently. He said the PVV, that's his party, can no longer be ignored. We will govern, as it's set to win. I don't know if it's 35 in the end. It says 37 here. 37 seats, well ahead of its nearest rival, the left-wing alliance. So to fulfill his pledge to be prime minister for everyone, he will have to persuade other parties to join him in a coalition. His target is 76 seats in a 150-seat parliament. Unfortunately, with only sort of 35, maybe 37 seats, you'll need another 40 seats. It's a very fragmented parliament. I don't know if it's got... Yeah, you can see here, this shows you how difficult it is, especially when so many other parties have said they will refuse to go into coalition with the PVV. So they might be the largest party in terms of number of seats, but no one's got remotely near to 50% due to, I presume, the electoral process of being a representative, some kind of proportional representation. It means you're always going to have to do coalitions, which some people don't like, but actually coalitions tend to temper the extremes, as far as I can work out. So because you have to go into coalition with people who don't necessarily agree with you, if you're an extremist party like the PVV, the likelihood is if they go into coalition with anyone else, the other people they go into coalition with will be further to the centre or to the left than the PVV. So the PVV on the extreme right, for you guys, that's over here. So anyone they go into coalition with will be over here, and that will temper their worst extremes, because they say, yeah, we're not going to sanction that policy. We want something that's more aligned to us where we are. And so therefore, coalitions can be really good for that. Nonetheless, what else can we say? He told the BBC that, of course, he was willing to negotiate and compromise with other parties to become prime minister. He won after harnessing widespread frustration about migration, promising borders closed and putting on hold his promise to ban the Quran. So he's going to ban Islam, basically, is one of his things. He was in combative mood in his victory speech. We want to govern and we will govern. The seat numbers are an enormous compliment, but an enormous responsibility too. Before the vote, the three other big parties ruled out taking part in a Wilders-led government because of his far-right policies, but that might change because of the scale of his victory. The left-wing alliance under ex-EU Commissioner Frans Timmermans has become a distant second with 25 seats, according to the forecast based on 94% of the vote. He made clear he would have nothing to do with the Wilders-led government. We won't let anyone in the Netherlands go. In the Netherlands, everyone is equal, he told supporters. That leaves third place centre-right Liberal VVD under new leader Dylan Jezigloods and a brand new party formed by whistleblower MP Peter Peter Omtzigt in fourth, but both have congratulated him on the results. Although Mr. Yezigulz doubts Mr. Wilders will be able to find the numbers he needs, she says it is up to her party colleagues to decide how to respond. Before the election, she insisted she would not serve in a Wilders-led cabinet, but did not rule out working with him if she won. Okay, so we'll see where that goes. Who knows? But it's a shame for Ukraine because he is not one that's largely in support of Ukraine. So that is a challenge. He's actually pretty pro-Russian. So here we can see him, proudly standing in the Russian parliament. I think the pro-Russian leader of the party that is expected to win the Netherlands elections that were held today, says Ukraine Battle Map. In one of the last election debates, Wilders said that he would not support sending Ukraine more weapons even after Russia shot down the MH17 aircraft, killing 193 Dutch citizens, which was a really big component of why Netherlands have been so in support of Ukraine. You got The Hague there as well, doing their bit for international criminal court cases. It's another challenge to unified Ukrainian support within Europe, within the world. So the elections in the Netherlands were won by the extreme right, led by Geert Wilders, with a stunning result. He does not support further transfer of arms to Ukraine, says Max23. Now, I'm interested in this map, and you Dutch viewers out there, I know there are a number of you. Does this go? Usually, when the right do well, you can see an urban-rural divide. So it's been the same for an awful long time. And in fact, when you talk about the extreme right and when you talk about fascism, so if you look at the 10 pillars of fascism, as according to Jason Stanley in his book How Fascism Works, one of those is that rural-urban divide. So the urban centres are seen as urban degeneracy, is like centres of urban degeneracy, moral degeneracy, and you harken back to the bucolic heartlands, and you have this urban-rural divide. And actually, when you look at a map of Republican against Democrat control in the US, and when you look at Conservative against Labour control in the UK, most of the map looks broadly one colour. In the US that's red, and in the UK it's blue because of the colours of the parties. But you think, the map is overwhelmingly blue in the UK, and that's because of all the large rural areas that the Tories have control over. But the smaller but much more densely populated centres that Labour have control of, and it's the same with Republicans and Democrats, broadly speaking, in the US. And that's because conservatism has a much greater prominence in rural areas. Anyway, I was just wondering whether that's the case with this map in the Netherlands, if anyone wants to come in on that. I'm not saying anything remotely controversial, by the way, because the idea about those maps, you just go and look at the maps, that is literally how they map out. This is Radu Hosu, the political analyst from Romania, talking about Geert Wilders' success here. So from Putin with Love, Geert Wilders in the Russian Duma in 2018, and he's showing that picture again. The far-right party that Dutch Trump leads in Netherlands won the most seats in the Dutch parliament. I mean, that's what some people call him. If you like Trump, there you go. You'll like this guy probably, maybe, I don't know. After Hungary, Slovakia, it's now the turn. Hungary and Slovakia, it's now the turn of the Netherlands, the first to have explicitly shown their unwillingness to help Ukraine. The Netherlands, until today, a supporter of Ukraine's fight for freedom, will also fall into that same category if the PVV get their way. Russia effectively lost the war in Ukraine. Apart from the land bridge between Crimea and Donbass, it has failed to, in all of its original strategic objectives. Ukraine, however, has not won it yet. Russia instead is winning more and more states through parties it supports financially, through corruption and compromat blackmailable leaders who respond to orders from the Kremlin. And we'll talk about this in a second with regard to the border. what was I saying? Next year, several billion people, 4.5 billion, if calculated right, if I calculated it right, he says, will go to the polls. It's a historic year for humanity. Yes, this is really interesting. Yet next year is one of the biggest election years, I think, in history. Look it up on Wikipedia how many states have presidential, parliamentary, federal, union, and etc. elections to see for yourself. Trump, if he doesn't go to jail, will most likely win the US election. Interesting. We'll see about that. It's early doors yet, and there is a lot of talk that I don't want to get into that discussion. Anyway, people are fed up with the good, he says. Get ready for a crash landing. In case you think I'm fabulous, save the post and we'll talk at the end of 2024. What he means to say, in case you think I'm talking a pure fantasy, save this and we'll talk at the end of 2024. So that's his opinion on what's going on. You guys might have a different opinion. Now, talking about someone who is on the right, but where you put this man, Javier Milei, president of Argentina, the madman, as he's called, the guy who's like a far right libertarian, but has opinions that are all over the shop, wants to get rid of the peso, wants the US dollar, which means he might want to get closer to the US in terms of trade, is moving away from Brazil and China and Russia, and therefore is pro-Ukrainian, has been on the blower to Zelensky, and he's asked Zelensky to come over to host a conference on Ukraine in Argentina. So Zelensky said that he and Milei discussed the Ukrainian peace formula and the development of relations between the countries. So that's an interesting one to watch there. Here we have Pavel, what's his first name? Petr Pavel, that's it. President of the Czech Republic, or Czechia. EU countries perceive Russia as the number one threat to European security and are preparing for war with it in the foreseeable future, he has said. Quote, all NATO countries perceive Russia as the number one threat in Europe, and this implies the need to prepare realistically for such a threat. All armies take this threat seriously. All armies are preparing for the possibility of a high-intensity conflict in Europe, Pavel said in a meeting of the Visegrad Group presidents. Now, yes, it says EU countries perceive. Actually, he's talking about NATO countries, so I don't know if next to slightly misrepresented what he said. But NATO countries are perceiving Russia as the number one threat in Europe, I think, is without doubt, apart from maybe Viktor Orban. Okay, that should say border. So now we're going to go on to border issues and some fascinating stuff to talk about here. We'll start with Finland looking to close all but one Russian border crossing to stop asylum seekers that are being motivated to cross by Russia, arguably being paid for by Russia, being given bicycles because of the ruling about transport, so being given bicycles to cross the border into Finland. Not traditionally somewhere where you've seen a lot of migrants try to get across. Some people are claiming that's because of national because of conscription, annual conscription, that if you have to join the army, then that's not too cool. So I don't really want to go there if I'm going to be a young man wanting to get a job or whatever. So I don't know whether that's genuinely a thing, but you don't normally see a lot of immigrants. Well, and then suddenly this surge of immigration that Russia is promoting, it's causing consternation along a number of these borders, to the point that Norway and Estonia may close border crossings with Russia, and that is something that is on the cards. Well, in fact, Norwegian Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Støre has allowed the closure of the only checkpoint on the border with Russia, according again to Nexta there. So this is happening. This is an issue. And of course, we have all the issues in Poland and Slovakia. So Polish border protest organizer plans to extend the blockade until February. Rafał Mekler, the organizer of the Polish trucker protest on the Polish border with Ukraine, announced on Twitter his intention to extend the blockade until February the 1st. Right. I read this yesterday and I thought, surely Russia must be involved. Surely Russia must be involved in some way, in the same way as they are with the immigrants on the border in Finland and elsewhere. They must be stoking this somehow. There must be some connection between these border protests and whoever this guy is, Rafał Mekler, and Russia. And then lo and behold, just after I had like 10 minutes of thinking about this, Tim White posted, one of the big domestic stories and problems for Ukraine right now is the blocking of borders in Poland and Slovakia. Protesters supposedly demand fair competition and stop exports from Ukraine. This investigation found direct involvement by Russia. Oh, right. Now it all bloody well makes sense, doesn't it? Anyway, this is from Guildhall. Says, Russian special services may be involved in blocking the borders of Ukraine and investigations. This is a translation, a Google translation, so hopefully it all makes sense. As part of the investigation by the Guildhall news agency, it was established that Polish carriers who blocked checkpoints on the Polish-Ukrainian border demanding fair competition interact with persons with ties to the Russian Federation. Russian influence has also been established in a framework of similar events in Slovakia. Who knew? Thus, the official organisation of the blockade of the border between Poland and Ukraine is Polish citizen Rafał Mekler, owner of the transport company Rafał Mekler Transport. Rafał Mekler is a representative of a cell of the pro-Russian Confederation of Freedom and Independence Party in the Lublin Voivodeship, which has close ties to Russia. In particular, the leader of the party, Janusz Korwin-Mikke, called for the recognition of the occupation of Crimea, and himself visited the annexed peninsula in 2015, where he met with the head of Russian Occupation Administration of Crimea, Sergei Aksyonov. I mean, you can't get any more connected to saying, yes, I'm all for the occupation of Crimea illegally by Russia, and I'm going to go and visit Crimea and the Russian occupation leader myself. Oh, and by the way, I'm in charge of this party that is broadly involved in the blockade of the borders by Polish truckers. Confederation of Freedom and Independence is affiliated with another Polish right-wing organisation, the All Polish Youth, which has long-standing ties to the Russian imperial movement, among other things, which recruited terrorists for the DPR and LPR groups. The leader of the list of the Confederation of Freedom and Independence during the 2023 election campaign for the Polish Sejm, what's his name? Ziemowit, letters. It's not enough vowels, and they're in the wrong place. Kalski is the former leader of the All Poland Youth Movement. The Confederation of Freedom and Independence and the All Polish Youth hold joint events. The current action of the Polish-Ukrainian border is not the first episode in the participation of Polish carriers in campaigns that have signs of Russian active measures. Since the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Rafał Mekler Transport and a number of other Polish companies participating in the current protests, in particular, and it lists a bunch of them, have repeatedly held rallies demanding the lifting of anti-Russian sanctions. And there you go. And it goes on, gives more details. I'm just going to go to the end of the article where it says the organisers of the action in Slovakia were representatives of the public organisation Union of Road Carriers of Slovakia, or UNAS. The action was supported by the anti-European right-wing radical party Our Slovakia, which advocates the restoration of friendly ties with Russia, whose leader, Slovak politician Marian Kotleba, wrote a letter to former Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych in 2014, where she compared the revolution of dignity, so the Euromaidan protest, with terrorism. So you can see that the Polish-Ukrainian and Slovak-Ukrainian border issues have links, real tangible links to Russia. And you can imagine that they are just kind of fulfilling Russian desires in so doing. It just doesn't surprise me one iota. Right. I'm going to go back to the video I did yesterday that many of you said, oh, thanks for doing that one on economics and tax. It was nothing to do with Ukraine. And then a bunch of you were like, no, I completely disagree, which is exactly what I knew would happen. And I put these things out there. So if you disagree with me, bring the receipts. Let's have a debate. Change my mind. I've changed my mind on most major things in the world, from belief in God to whether we have free will. We don't. To my politics. So I was kind of centrist, centre-right when I was younger, just following my parents, and now I've gone centre-left, to all sorts of different things due to my philosophical investigations. I've changed my opinion on virtually every major thing in the world. So it's not like I'm some dogmatic guy that's never going to change his opinion. Literally not true. So rather than get angry or whatever, let's talk about it, and let's. The whole point of this is to stimulate debate. And anyway, when I was doing one sort of rebuttal to some claims that someone made in the comments. I spent far too long doing that this morning. Probably why I'm a bit late. I came across this article on, and this is linked to Ukraine. So please remember this is linked to Ukraine. The Forbes Philanthropy Score 2023, how charitable are the richest Americans? And it's the idea that the members of the Forbes 400 have made a lot of money. They haven't given all that much of it away. And it looks at actually that not many billionaires are particularly generous, philanthropically speaking. But there are a bunch who are, right? And it lists some of the most philanthropic. And, John Arnold, Edith Broad, Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, Melinda French Gates, Amos Hotzetter, Pierre Omidyar, Mackenzie Scott, Lynn Schusterman, Jeff Skoll, and George Soros. I thought, well, that's interesting. George Soros is a really interesting figure because he absolutely is a bogeyman of the right, particularly in America. A lot of people hate him and claim he does things that he doesn't do. But people hate him in Eastern Europe, in Hungary. So he is, because of his Jewish background and because he's got liberal institutions that he's put in place in Budapest, he is Viktor Orban's number one enemy, it appears. Anyway, reading further down this article, it said, this summer, the 93-year-old handed the reins to his son because so why is this important? So for the 4th year in a row, hedge fund tycoon and prominent left-wing supporter George Soros is the biggest giver of all, as measured by percentage of fortune. He's donated more than $19 billion, nearly 3 times his current net worth, over the past 4 decades, almost exclusively through his open society foundations, which focus on areas of democratic principles like freedom of expression, human rights, and climate justice. So he's a left-winger that does an awful lot of philanthropy, and that really pisses off the right. Now, this summer, the 93-year-old handed the reins to his son Alex Soros, who announced plans for the organization to reduce headcount significantly and shift its focus away from Western Europe towards the US and Ukraine. And that made me go, oh, hello, I'm not sure I knew about this. So then I did a bit of research, and it says, and he actually visited Zelensky, and this might be really kind of meaningful financial assistance to Ukraine. No matter what happens, we will continue to support Ukraine. The chairman of the board of the Open Society Foundations, Alexander Soros, said, visiting Ukraine. During a meeting with a team of International Renaissance Foundation, which is part of the Open Society Foundation's network, Alexander said, Ukraine is a place where my father, George Soros, spent a lot of time and where he directed many of his efforts to build the Open Society. I came to express my solidarity. Our support for Ukraine remains steadfast. It doesn't matter what happens on a battlefield. It doesn't matter what happens in the US. We will continue to support Ukraine and the International Renaissance Foundation, which works here. This is really cool, and I like that because Ukraine needs as much help as it can get, obviously. He met representatives of civil society organizations to hear their opinions on the visions and on the situation in Ukraine, to discuss ways that the Open Society Foundations and the International Renaissance Foundation can help Ukraine preserve freedom and democracy. So important, that fight for democracy against the insidious invasion in our headspace of the disinformation projects that are enacted by Russia. Anyway, interesting. The University of Budapest, a Central European University, the Institute for Advanced Study there, that Central European University is the one created by Soros, which I think has largely been shut down by Viktor Orban, because nothing says dictator like shutting down academic institutions that you think are too liberal. Nothing says fascism like that. Hey, Viktor Orban. Anyway, Soros's Open Society Foundations announces new projects in Ukraine. I just find it interesting, that I didn't really know about this. So, Open Society Foundation, an organization founded by George Soros. It plans to implement new projects in Ukraine to support Ukrainians in a full-scale war. The Prime Minister said the priorities include, so this is Denis Shmyhal talking about this, economic recovery, rebuilding, social sphere, and programs to support small and medium-sized businesses, particularly veteran businesses. Shmyhal also said mine clearance, energy, and logistics were long-term areas of cooperation. We focused separately on establishing justice. We must hold Russia accountable and make it pay, particularly in confiscating frozen assets in the West, he said, without elaborating on further details. So that is with regard to cooperating with Open Society Foundations, which has been working in Ukraine since 1990. Anyway, I thought that's interesting information. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share, and let me know what you think about all these topics and whether you're angry that I've mentioned X, Y, and Z. Tell me why that's not cool in the threads below, and we'll have a debate. In the meantime, take care. Toodle pips.